The quiet nurse moved through Seattle General's corridors at 6 in the morning like someone who'd learned to displace less air than she occupied. Danielle Ross in her blue scrubs, dark hair pulled back with military precision, badge clipped to her pocket at exactly a 45-degree angle. Her sensible shoes made no sound on the linoleum. The hallways belonged to her at this hour, empty, fluorescent lit, humming with the low frequency of machines that never slept. She'd chosen San Antonio specifically. The hospital sat 40 minutes from Fort Sam Houston, close enough to matter, far enough to stay invisible. The supply room at Seattle General was her cathedral. Inventory logs spread across a metal table. Boxes stacked in descending height order. Each trauma cart organized by frequency of use, items positioned for one-handed access. Danielle had rearranged it twice already in the 3 months she'd been here. The staff thought she was obsessive. The truth was simpler, her hands remembered how to prepare for chaos. She found the folded flag in her locker each morning before rounds. 21 folds. Precise. The way the Army taught you. Sergeant First Class James Halloway, 75th Ranger Regiment, killed in a field hospital in Ramadi when an IED detonated 30 meters outside the medical tent. Danielle had held his hand when she understood what the bleeding meant. She'd kept his flag folded the same way she kept her captain's bars, hidden, classified, known to no one at this hospital except a 3-month-old personnel file that said only RN, excellent technical skills, independent worker. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she touched the flag, held it for 2 seconds, replaced it. Ritual. Every shift. The smell of antiseptic and old coffee from yesterday's pot hung in the small space. She closed the locker door quietly and moved toward the ICU. Room 347. Bay 4. The patient in that bed had arrived 3 days ago, unconscious, with severe blunt force trauma and compound fractures consistent with an IED blast. No wallet. No phone. No identification. Just boots, sand still embedded in the canvas, and a combat badge tucked inside the right boot like a secret. Danielle had found the badge during intake while cataloging his belongings. Her hands had gone still. The insignia was familiar. Not just familiar, known. Memorized years ago in a briefing room with maps and satellite images and photographs of a man whose decisions kept people alive in an impossible place. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Chen. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines out of Camp Lejeune. Her son's commanding officer. The man she'd been embedded at Seattle General for 93 days specifically to protect. She didn't allow herself to process that information in the intake bay. She'd simply documented the badge, sealed it in an evidence envelope, and moved on to blood pressure and Glasgow coma scale scores and the 1,000 small observations that fill a nurse's morning. But later, in the supply room, she'd pulled his file and confirmed what she already knew. The injury pattern matched the blast radius in Ramadi. The timeline aligned with the operation her son had mentioned in a coded message 2 weeks prior. Chen was here. He was unconscious. And someone knew he was a high-value intelligence asset. Which meant Danielle's mission had changed from protection to active prevention. She checked his vitals now without looking at him. That was part of the invisibility. Part of the mask. Competent but unremarkable. Careful but not curious. A nurse doing her job. The vital signs came back steady. BP 118/74. Heart rate 62. O2 sat 98% on room air. His body was doing what she'd trained it to do, survive. She was adjusting his full line, watching the saline drip with the focused attention of someone who understood that small things cascaded into larger ones, when she heard the Italian shoes on the linoleum. Dr. James Pierce entered room 347 like he owned the building. Which, in a practical sense, he did. Chief of Surgery at Seattle General for 8 years. Board certified. Published in 3 journals. An invited speaker at conferences. Hands that people trusted. Eyes that calculated everything in terms of expense and return. Ms. Ross. His voice carried the particular tone of a man speaking to someone whose name he'd already forgotten. Checking inventory. She was checking his fall line, actually. She was making sure the placement was optimal and the flow rate was appropriate and the sterile field remained uncompromised. But she answered him the way she answered all questions from Dr. Pierce, briefly, without elaboration, without presumption. "Routine assessment, doctor." He moved to the bedside, and Danielle stepped back the precise distance that allowed him space without surrendering the room. "Our mysterious ranger." Still no identification. Militaries being remarkably tight-lipped about him. She didn't respond. Silence was safer. Silence was information. Pierce studied the patient's face with the expression of a man examining a financial projection. High-value operative, apparently. They've put a security detail on the floor. Restricted access to family. Very interesting. He glanced at Danielle, and she felt the weight of his attention the way you feel a pressure change before a storm. "You seem very interested in this particular patient, Ms. Ross." "All patients require complete attention, doctor." "Of course." He smiled in a way that didn't change his eyes. "Just a nurse doing her job. Nothing more." He left, shoes clicking, and Danielle allowed herself one measured breath. The way he'd emphasized just a nurse would have landed differently on someone else. On someone who didn't understand the architecture of institutional power. On someone who wasn't trained to recognize threats before they materialized. She finished her assessment. Checked the monitor settings. Verified the medication orders. Everything done with the same mechanical precision she brought to every task. The same hands that had performed a field thoracotomy with a combat knife in a hospital tent outside Ramadi were now adjusting oxygen lines with textbook perfection. At 0710 hours, the morning shift change began. Nurses filtered through the corridors. The hospital accelerated into consciousness. Danielle moved with the flow, charted her observations, maintained her profile. The quiet nurse. Competent. Independent. Unremarkable. By 8:15 she was sitting in the staff meeting, notepad in front of her, watching Dr. Pierce brief the surgical team on the day's cases. 14 operations scheduled. 2 trauma surgeries pending. A perforated ulcer from the ER. A hernia repair. Pierce commanded the room with the casual authority of someone whose decisions were never questioned. His hands moved as he talked. Strong hands. Capable hands. The kind of hands that earned trust even when the brain behind them was calculating kickback percentages from a medical supply company that was still, for the moment, unknown to everyone except the nurse taking notes in the back row. She wrote in shorthand. Procedure names. Times. Patient IDs. And other things. Inventory discrepancies she'd noticed in the trauma supply orders. Phantom line items. Billing that didn't align with actual usage. The kind of patterns that only became visible if you paid attention. If you understood how supply chains worked. If your training included not just how to heal but how to recognize when institutions were feeding on themselves from the inside. Dr. Pierce glanced at her once during the meeting, and she made sure to look unremarkable. Not afraid. Not curious. Not the kind of person who kept a classified personnel file in a locker next to a folded flag. Just a nurse. Just someone taking notes. The meeting adjourned at 8:30. People dispersed. Danielle remained seated for exactly 3 seconds longer, then stood and moved toward the ICU. The hospital around her hummed with its particular frequency. Heart monitors beeping in steady rhythm. Ventilators whooshing. Shoes on tile. A code blue called somewhere in the building, not a real emergency, just someone's drill, just the constant preparation for crisis that hospitals maintained like a background hum. By noon she was back in room 347. Lieutenant Colonel Chen remained unconscious, his body healing itself with the mechanical precision of modern medicine. Danielle checked his lines again. Reviewed the labs. Noted that his kidney function was improving, that the inflammation markers were declining, that he was doing exactly what a trained body does when given the resources to survive. What he didn't know was that someone at this hospital wanted him dead. Not for medical reasons. Not for anything personal. But because of what he carried in his mind. Because of the intelligence locked in his experience. Because in the architecture of certain institutional crimes, potential witnesses were liabilities. Danielle Ross, Army captain, embedded for 93 days in a hospital in San Antonio, understood this with the clarity of someone who'd spent a decade understanding exactly how people died and how to prevent it. She pulled his chart, made her notes, and prepared the response that would reshape both their lives when everything moved from waiting to action. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part would come when Dr. Pierce realized exactly who she was. Dr. Pierce cornered her outside room 347 at shift change, his voice carrying down the hallway like a tank engine idling in a garage. The ranger's wife stood frozen mid-step. His elderly father gripped the doorframe. "Nurse Ross, perhaps you can explain to Mr. Chen why his son's pain medication was administered 40 minutes late." Pierce's jaw was tight, calculated. His eyes held something worse than anger, opportunity. Danielle's clipboard showed the correct timing. 1,400 hours. She documented it herself, her handwriting precise as a targeting system. "I administered at 1,400 as ordered, doctor." Her voice stayed level, a knife without an edge. "The digital record will show." "Are you calling me a liar, Nurse Ross?" He stepped closer. His cologne smelled like money and the kind of cologne men wore when they needed to cover something underneath. Or just incompetent. The words hung in the fluorescent brightness. Chen's wife looked away. The father's face hardened, suddenly unsure who to believe. Pierce leaned in, dropping his voice just enough that only she could hear clearly, but loud enough that the family caught every word. "Maybe night shift Nora here needs some remedial training." The nickname landed precisely where he intended, a nickname from a shift she'd never worked, a detail he'd invented whole cloth to make her seem unreliable, scattered, lost. Incompetent. The kind of nurse who gets confused about schedules. The kind of nurse nobody listens to. Her jaw clenched once. Imperceptibly. Her pupils didn't dilate. Her breathing didn't change. She turned back to her chart, pen moving in steady, deliberate lines, vital stable, O2 sat 96%, heart rate 68, pupils reactive and equal. Her hands wrote as though Dr. Pierce hadn't spoken at all, as though he were background noise, a monitor beeping in another patient's room. The absence of reaction infuriated him more than any argument would have. She wasn't giving him the satisfaction of watching her break. "We'll discuss this in my office," he said quietly, already knowing she would go, already knowing she would sit in that chair and listen to accusations manufactured from air. "Tomorrow." 0600. She nodded once and continued charting. What happened next didn't just silence the room, it began the process of erasing her. By the next morning, something had shifted at Seattle General in San Antonio. The break room felt different when Danielle entered at noon with her Tupperware container of leftover grilled chicken and rice. 4 nurses sat at the corner table. The moment she sat down at the opposite table, their conversation stopped mid-sentence. They stood in unison, trays in hands, moving to the other side of the room with the synchronized precision of people who'd been given silent instructions. The refrigerator hummed. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects. She took a bite of her sandwich. The chicken was dry. She chewed anyway, face neutral, but her knuckles whitened slightly on the Tupperware edge, pressing down just hard enough that a drop of condensation formed on the plastic. She released it. Breathed. Continued eating. No one spoke to her. No one asked how her morning had been. No one mentioned the new admission in room for 12 or the discharged patient from the psychu. The break room became a place where she existed but didn't belong, a ghost in scrubs taking up space at an otherwise empty table. She finished her lunch in 14 minutes and returned to her rounds, her presence forgotten before she reached the door. By Thursday, the formal write-up appeared on the unit board. It was posted at 08 for 7, during shift change when the maximum number of staff would see it. Typed on official hospital letterhead, signed by Dr. Pierce himself. Disciplinary action, D. Ross, failure to follow chain of command. The words were clinical, precise, devastating in their vagueness. No specific incident cited. No date. No context. Just her name and the accusation that she didn't understand hierarchy, didn't respect protocol, didn't know her place. 12 staff members walked past it between 0847 and 0900. Some read it carefully. Some pretended not to notice. Some made eye contact with her deliberately, then looked away. Pierce stood at the nurse's station with his arms crossed, watching her read it from across the unit. He was waiting to see the moment when it would break her. The moment when the quiet nurse would finally crack, cry in the bathroom, call HR, do something desperate and visible. He wanted witnesses. She removed the paper from the board, folded it precisely into thirds, placed it in her scrub pocket, and returned to her rounds without a word. Her face was a mask. Her movements were steady. She documented vitals, adjusted oxygen flow on a CAP patient, reviewed lab work, checked medication orders. She moved through Seattle General as though the write-up was irrelevant, as though her professional reputation hadn't just been shredded in front of every nurse on her floor. But that wasn't the worst part. That night, working the evening shift into night, she remained visible, present, competent. No mistakes. No hesitation. No cracks. Pierce watched her from the nurse's station, frustrated by her refusal to unravel. At 2,147 hours, as the unit settled into the quiet hum of sleeping patients and steady monitors, she found herself alone in the supply closet. The door closed behind her. Shelves of bandages, catheters, suction equipment, for bags arranged in perfect rows. Fluorescent light bleeding from underneath the door. She closed her eyes and allowed herself 3 deep breaths, the kind of breathing she'd learned in Ramadi when the mortars started hitting, when you had to stay functional because people were dying and they needed you functional. Her hand pressed against the cool shelf. The trembling came then, not from fear but from restraint, the shaking of someone holding themselves together through sheer will, muscles locked against the release that would come if she let them go. She wouldn't cry. Her training wouldn't allow it. But her body wanted to break against the weight of being unseen, unheard, dismissed, attacked by someone who had no idea who he was attacking. The flag was in her locker. The folded triangle from her friend Rodriguez's funeral in Arlington, the one that had been folded by military hands over the casket of someone she'd tried and failed to save in Ramadi. That flag had traveled with her through 12 years, 3 tours, 2 continents. It reminded her that humiliation meant nothing. Survival meant everything. She opened her eyes. Steadied her breathing. Removed her hands from the shelf and returned to the unit at 2,151 hours, composure restored. What she didn't know was that Dr. Pierce was already making his next move. The supply closet door had a small window. He'd watched her from the hallway. He'd seen her press her hands against the shelf. He'd seen what he interpreted as weakness. He didn't see discipline. He didn't see someone who'd survived worse than his manufactured accusations. He saw only a nurse breaking, and it made him confident enough to escalate. The next morning, the reassignment notice appeared in her email. Effective immediately. She was being transferred to the geriatric wing on the 4th floor. Ward for East. Away from the ICU. Away from room 347. Away from the ranger she was supposed to protect. She filed a request to reverse the transfer through proper channels. The request disappeared into HR and came back denied within 6 hours. No explanation. No appeal process offered. The decision was final. Her keycard began failing at certain doors. The security system told her the access was temporary, undergoing maintenance, nothing to worry about. But she knew better. Each failed swipe was intentional. Each locked door was a message. Dr. Pierce was erasing her proximity to whatever he was protecting, and he was doing it methodically, officially, in ways that no one could challenge because the system itself was doing the erasing. She stood in front of room 347 one last time, watching Lieutenant Colonel Chen sleeping peacefully, his vitals stable, his pain managed. His wife had gone home an hour ago. His elderly father was in the family waiting room, reading a newspaper from 3 days ago. Chen's hand rested on the blanket, relaxed, dreaming something better than morphine could give him. She memorized the moment. Her last official look at the patient she'd been sent to protect. At 1,630 hours, she clocked out and walked to the employee parking garage, her keycard already updated in the system to reflect her new assignment. Ward for East. 12 geriatric patients. No classified intelligence. No ranger commanders. No mission worth protecting. She sat in her car for 15 minutes before starting the engine. The parking garage was quiet except for the sound of water dripping from a broken gutter, each drop hitting the concrete like a countdown. She had been invisible in the system. Now the system was actively pushing her out. But what Dr. Pierce didn't understand was that invisibility had always been her strength. It wasn't a weakness he'd discovered. It was a weapon she'd been carrying all along. She started the car and drove toward her apartment, already knowing what came next. The call came at 2:33 p.m. All available hands to the emergency department. Code Yellow activation. A highway pileup on Interstate 37, 14 trauma cases incoming, first ambulance for minutes out. Danielle was in the geriatrics ward, changing an 4-line on Mrs. Chen, no relation to the lieutenant colonel, when the overhead speaker crackled. She finished the line with steady hands, documented the time, and moved toward the stairwell like someone answering a familiar call. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she climbed, her scrubs already damp from the day's work, her mind already shifting into the compartmentalized focus that came from 3 tours in Ramadi. The emergency department was organized chaos. Gurneys lined the corridors. Nurses in blue and trauma techs in yellow moved between bays like a choreographed dance that only came together under extreme pressure. The smell hit her first, gasoline and copper and the sharp metallic tang of blood underneath the hospital's perpetual antiseptic hum. Danielle took in the scene. 14 patients meant they were using all 6 trauma bays plus the overflow spaces. One nurse was being called in from surgery. Another was pulling from maternity. They needed her. Nobody asked questions when the pagers went out. You answered, or you didn't. Dr. Pierce was in Trauma Bay 1, working a chest wound. He glanced up as Danielle arrived, took in her presence with something that looked like satisfaction, and pointed without speaking toward Bay 3. The motion was what hierarchy looked like in a hospital. Not a request. A command. She moved to the bay where a 32-year-old male, GSW to the chest, gunshot wound from the pileup when a construction vehicle's propane tank ruptured, was being prepped for imaging. Blood pressure already dropping. Respiration rate climbing. The monitor beeped a steady rhythm that was growing too fast. 2 nurses were working the lines. A resident was calling out vital signs. Danielle positioned herself at the left side of the patient's chest, reading the clinical picture like a sonnet she'd memorized in a combat aid station 7 years ago. Breath sounds absent on the left side. The patient's oxygen saturation dropping. His neck veins distended, pushing upward like they were being strangled from the inside out. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space, collapsing the left lung, pushing the heart rightward, crushing the right side. Textbook presentation. Fatal in minutes if untreated. The resident looked frozen, mouth slightly open, eyes tracking the monitor as though watching it would somehow change the numbers. The attending was 3 bays away. There was no time for protocols. There was only pressure and physics and a patient who was about to flatline. Danielle moved. Her hands were already reaching for the emergency kit, the needle, the alcohol prep, the landmarks burned into muscle memory from field hospitals where there was no time to call up the chain of command. She didn't ask. She didn't announce. Her fingers found the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the anatomical point where a needle becomes a lifeline. The skin prepped. The angle calculated in milliseconds. The 14-gauge angiocath needle went in with a precise thrust, angled 20 degrees, between the ribs where the anatomy left room for skill. The hiss came first. Air escaping, decompression, the sound of pressure releasing like a tire punctured on the highway. Immediate and unmistakable. The patient's body relaxed, his spine dropping back against the mattress. His breathing deepened. His oxygen saturation began climbing. 88, 92, 95, the monitor's rhythm steadied into something that resembled survival. The resident blinked, suddenly remembering he had a job. The nurses moved into the next steps: chest tube preparation, surgery notification, transfer to the ICU track. Everything she'd just done was supposed to happen in an OR with an attending's orders and a full surgical team standing by. Everything she'd just done had come from a place before she wore scrubs. Before she had a name in this hospital. Before she learned to be invisible. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Dr. Pierce was there, his presence filling the bay like someone had dropped a heavy stone into still water. His face had gone the color of old ivory, except for 2 spots of red climbing his cheekbones. His eyes found hers with the precision of a targeting system. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice was controlled ice. The kind of quiet that made every person in the bay look up from their tasks. Danielle kept her hand steady. One of them was still extended from the needle decompression. She met his eyes without blinking, without the slightest flicker of the fear response that a civilian might show when being confronted by the hospital's most powerful surgeon in front of 6 witnesses. The composure she'd learned in intelligence training held firm. "Tension pneumothorax," she said. Her voice was level, surgical in its precision. Needle decompression at the second intercostal space. "He's stable now." Pierce's jaw tightened. She could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. The realization that the patient was alive. The realization that she'd done it without his authorization. The realization that in a trauma situation, under the rules of critical care, a nurse who sees a life-threatening condition can initiate emergency interventions if the attending is unavailable. Protocol. Not procedure. But Pierce didn't care about protocol. Pierce cared about control. "You just practiced outside your scope, Nurse Ross," he said. The words came out precise and sharp. "That's grounds for immediate termination. You don't touch a patient without orders. You don't perform procedures. You're a nurse. You call for help. You don't become the help." The other people in the bay had gone very still. The resident was staring at the monitor, suddenly fascinated by the O2 saturation numbers. The trauma techs were focused on the chest tube kit with the intensity of surgeons. Danielle had seen this dynamic before, not in hospitals, but in interrogation rooms where one person was being isolated in front of others. The removal of allies through tactical embarrassment. The establishment of dominance through public correction. She didn't respond. Didn't defend. Didn't explain. Her hands lowered. She turned back to the patient to ensure the needle placement was secure, that the O2 line was positioned correctly. Her movements were methodical, professional, the movements of someone doing her job. Not acknowledging that her job, according to Pierce, had just ended. Pierce watched her for a moment longer, then grabbed her arm and pulled her into the hallway. The fluorescent lights were brighter out there, more clinical. The sounds of the other bays muffled behind the swinging doors. His grip was hard enough to be intentional, let go before it could be called assault. "I'm calling an emergency board review," he said. "Effective immediately, you're suspended pending investigation. Your credentials are under review. You violated hospital policy, patient safety protocol, and the scope of nursing practice. I'm notifying administration and the board chair within the hour." Danielle met his eyes. The composure didn't break. The mask of civilian nurse stayed in place. Inside, she was already calculating the damage. Chen was on the 4th floor. Her keycard access had already been restricted. Once the suspension went official, security would be informed. She wouldn't be able to reach him. She wouldn't be able to monitor him. She wouldn't be able to protect him. And Pierce would make sure of it. "I saved his life," she said. The words came out flat, not argumentative. Just fact. "You violated protocol," Pierce said. "There's a difference." He turned and walked away, back toward the bays, back toward his position as the most important person in the hospital. Danielle stood in the hallway and felt the mission fracture like glass. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 45 minutes later when she tried to access the 4th floor and her keycard was rejected. She tried the stairwell. Security stopped her before she reached the landing. A young officer, maybe 24, with the apologetic expression of someone following orders he didn't understand. "Doctor's orders," he said. "Your access is restricted pending the board review. I can't let you up there." She could have pushed. She could have invoked protocol, argued the restriction was illegal, used the chain of command. But every option would make her visible. Every argument would create records. And Pierce was already creating records. The incident report would be in her file by end of shift. The board review would be scheduled. The hospital administration would be talking to their legal counsel about a nurse who'd performed a procedure outside her scope, even if that procedure had saved a life. She turned away from the stairwell and walked back down to the main level. Her uniform felt too tight. The fluorescent light seemed too bright. Her hands, which had held the needle with perfect steadiness just minutes ago, now felt like they belonged to someone else entirely. The folded flag was still in her locker. The combat badge was in Chen's boot, tucked away in a drawer somewhere in a hospital room she could no longer access. She'd been embedded at Seattle General for 3 months specifically to protect the lieutenant colonel. To watch over him while he healed. To ensure that the intelligence he carried, details about enemy networks that made him a target even stateside, stayed secure until he could be debriefed at a classified location. Now she was locked out. Suspended. Under investigation. The mission was unraveling in real time, and the architect of her destruction was having coffee in the physician's lounge with people who signed her paychecks. Danielle changed back into civilian clothes in the locker room. Her hands moved through the motions with precision. Shirt off. Scrubs folded with military exactness. Everything in its place. She sat on the bench in front of her locker for exactly 30 seconds. Just 30 seconds to let the weight of what had happened settle. Then she closed the locker door, picked up her bag, and walked toward the exit. She had 12 hours before the board review was scheduled. 12 hours to figure out how to protect Chen from outside the hospital. 12 hours to anticipate Pierce's next move. 12 hours before the Pentagon found out that their embedded operative had blown her cover in front of 6 witnesses and a chief of surgery who was already creating the narrative that would destroy her. She didn't know yet that the narrative was about to be destroyed itself. The hospital administrator's office smelled like expensive coffee and leather furniture that cost more than Danielle's annual salary. The termination letter sat on his mahogany desk like a loaded weapon, the 3 pages crisp and official, every word selected by someone with a law degree standing behind it. Administrator Hartley didn't meet her eyes when he slid it across. Effective immediately. We cannot tolerate nurses who endanger patients with unauthorized procedures. Behind him, Dr. Pierce stood with his arms crossed, shoulders relaxed, the satisfied expression of a man watching his enemy fall without lifting a finger. His tie was silk. His watch was gold. Danielle's jaw tightened imperceptibly. She read the letter in 15 seconds, the emergency board review's findings, the citation of practicing outside nursing scope, the determination that her actions, regardless of outcome, violated hospital protocol. The word insubordination appeared twice. "I request a formal hearing," Danielle said. Her voice came out steady. Clinical. The voice of someone discussing a patient's discharge plan, not her own professional execution. Administrator Hartley shook his head. "Your request is noted and denied. Security will escort you from the building. You have 1 hour to collect personal items from your locker." Pierce smiled. It was the kind of smile that belonged on a shark. Danielle turned and walked from the office without another word, her movements precise and measured, the same way she'd walked out of Ramadi 3 years ago, with nothing but what she could carry and the absolute certainty that looking back would change nothing about what was already broken behind her. The fluorescent lights in the hallway suddenly felt like surveillance. She could feel Pierce's eyes on her back, could feel the weight of his victory settling into the hospital's air like a change in pressure before a storm. 12 hours. That's all it would take before her entire world inverted in ways neither of them could see coming. But she didn't know that yet. The hospital locker room was empty at 4:33 p.m. on a Thursday. The industrial smell of cleaning chemicals hung thick in the air, mixing with the metallic undertone of stainless steel lockers and the ghost of 1,000 shifts, coffee spills, antiseptic, the faint copper tang that never fully left the hospital's atmosphere no matter how many times they scrubbed. Danielle opened her locker and looked at the space that had held her life for 3 months. A personal photo of her and her son, taken 6 years ago at his high school graduation, his Ranger contract fresh and unsigned, futures still unwritten. Her spare stethoscope. A half-finished bottle of ibuprofen. And in the corner, protected by a clear plastic sleeve, the folded flag. 21 folds, each crease sharp enough to cut paper. Each fold a ceremony she'd performed by hand in her apartment at 3 in the morning, 3 years ago, after receiving the notification that Specialist Daniel Ghost Reeves had been killed by an IED blast while clearing a building in Jolin District. Ghost had been her friend. Her teammate at the forward surgical team. Her reason for learning to hold someone's heart in her hands while bullets hit walls. The flag had been folded in an army chapel that she hadn't attended. She'd folded it again herself because that's what soldiers did, they honored the ritual even when the ritual had already failed them. She held it now, running her thumb along the triangle edge, feeling the fabric still holding the warmth of the dryer from laundry day. The weight of it was impossible for something so small. Failure had weight. She could feel it pressing against her ribs. She'd been embedded at Seattle General for exactly 93 days, tasked with protecting a man whose intelligence about enemy networks made him a target even stateside. She'd found him using a combat badge, a piece of metal no bigger than her thumbnail, the kind of thing a man kept in his boot because dog tags made too much noise. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Chen. Her son's former commanding officer. The last person her son had spoken to before the convoy was ambushed 300 kilometers outside of Tikrit. She'd failed to protect him. Worse, she'd blown her cover doing it, using her combat medicine training in front of 6 witnesses and a surgeon with enough institutional power to make sure nobody asked why a nurse knew how to perform an emergency needle decompression like she'd done it 100 times under fire. Because she had. That evening, she was in the hospital laundry room, the place where nobody looked, the place where the hospital's dirty work literally got cleaned. Industrial washing machines hummed their monotonous rhythm, and the air was thick with steam and the sharp chemical bite of quaternary ammonia, the smell that meant sanitation, meant erasure, meant clean slate. She folded her scrubs one final time. Corners meeting corners with military precision. Each fold deliberate and slow, the kind of fold that could be done blindfolded after enough repetition. The fabric was still warm from the industrial dryer. She'd changed into civilian clothes, jeans and a grey sweater that made her look like anyone else in San Antonio, which was the point of civilian clothes. Her scrubs, though, belonged to Seattle General. They were property. She was not. She stacked the folded scrubs in the return bin, her fingers lingering on the name tag she'd never wear again. The indignity of it burned in her chest like heartburn, but her face remained a mask. An orderly passed by pushing a laundry cart, wouldn't make eye contact, the same way people hadn't made eye contact with her all week. Invisible nurses were easy to ignore. Dangerous nurses who saved lives by breaking protocol were not. She placed the folded flag in her bag alongside the scrubs, tucked it against her side, and walked toward the hospital exit. The parking lot at 6:15 p.m. was mostly empty. Rain had started to fall, the kind of San Antonio rain that came without warning and felt like the sky had decided to cry. She could see Dr. Pierce through the upper windows of the administrative wing, standing motionless in his office, phone to his ear, his free hand gesturing the way surgeons gestured when they were problem-solving. Except the problem was a woman he'd successfully destroyed. She could almost read his lips from the parking lot. The Ross problem is handled. That's when her phone buzzed. An encrypted message on a line that only her handler knew about. Secondary target arriving your location 0900 tomorrow. High-value detainee. Medical transport. Maintain cover if possible. She stared at the words for a full minute. Maintain cover if possible. Her cover was ashes. Her cover had been scattered across the emergency department like the results of a pathology lab. Her cover was sitting in a termination letter with her signature required in triplicate. She turned the phone off and sat in her car for 20 minutes without starting the engine, watching rain hit the windshield and accumulate in patterns that looked like intelligence reports, chaotic connections, overlapping data, predictions that didn't account for the variables that actually mattered. At 8:50 the next morning, Danielle pushed through Seattle General's main entrance using the single-day grace period listed in her termination letter. 1 hour to collect anything else she'd forgotten. She moved through the hallways like a ghost, like someone who already existed in the past tense, her civilian clothes making her invisible in a way her scrubs never had. Nobody stopped her. Nobody looked at her. She was already gone in every way that mattered to this building. That's when the ER erupted in controlled chaos. The sound came first, boots on tile, synchronized and heavy, the kind of footsteps that belong to people trained to move as units. Armed Marines in full tactical gear escorted a gurney through the doors, weapons secured, eyes forward, the presence of military authority making the air pressure change like a storm front rolling in. A prisoner in orange jumpsuit restraints lay on the stretcher, dark blood soaking the gauze on his abdomen, gunshot wound entry site visible, surgery needed in the next 4 minutes or he'd code on the table. Danielle pressed against the wall as they passed, part of the infrastructure now, not part of the action. The prisoner's head turned on the stretcher. His eyes found her face in the crowd. He went rigid against the restraints, muscles locked, recognition hitting him like defibrillator paddles. He whispered in accented English, the words carrying weight across 30 feet of hallway, Al-Malarika Al-Hamra. The Red Angel of Ramadi. The Marine escort sergeant's head snapped toward Danielle. The message was in Arabic. The call sign was classified. The sergeant's jaw tightened. Did he just call you? Or a Marine lieutenant stepped forward, boots clicking with lethal precision. I need this woman's personnel file. Immediately. And I need her statement on how a detainee in transport knows her identity. The hospital administrator, standing 30 feet away near the surgical prep area, pulled up the file on his tablet with hands that had started to shake. He didn't understand what was happening. Nobody understood what was happening. Dr. Pierce moved from the surgical prep room toward the lieutenant, his face cycling through expressions, confusion, calculation, then the expression of a man who suddenly recognized the shape of a threat he'd underestimated. The lieutenant's eye scanned the tablet. His jaw tightened. He began reading aloud, voice carrying through the ER in the way military voices carried, with authority that made the room listen. Captain Danielle Ross, United States Army, serial number, a nurse dropped a clipboard. The clattering echoed across the floor like a gavel. Staff members froze mid-step. Pierce's hands went rigid at his sides. This is highly irregular, he said, but his voice had lost its confidence. The lieutenant continued, louder, assigned to the 75th Ranger Regiment, Forward Surgical Team, Ramadi, Iraq, 2019 to 2021, another nurse's mouth fell open. The lieutenant flipped to a second document. His voice became ceremonial, Silver Star citation. For extraordinary heroism in combat operations, Captain Ross held a forward surgical facility under sustained enemy assault for 16 hours, performing 11 life-saving surgeries including 3 field thoracotomies with combat knife and field expedient instruments. The room went so quiet you could hear the rain outside hitting the windows. An orderly's eyes were wet. A resident standing near Trauma Bay 3 lowered her clipboard, staring at Danielle like she'd just realized she'd been standing next to a legend the whole time. Dr. Pierce opened his mouth. Closed it. Tried again, heroism aside, hospital policy, boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. Synchronized and deliberate. A two-star Army general entered the ER with four Pentagon investigators in dark suits, the kind of suits that belong to people who worked in buildings you never saw. The general stopped directly in front of Danielle and saluted. His hand came up precise and perfect, the kind of salute you gave to officers with rank, with history, with scars. "Captain Ross," he said. His voice was granite. "We received your field reports on the Med Supply Solutions kickback scheme. Your observations were accurate." Pierce's face went white. Not pale. White. The kind of white that came with the sudden recognition of a trap he'd already stepped into. The general continued, "Your embedded mission here was to protect Lieutenant Colonel Chen and investigate financial irregularities flagged on federal audits. You've accomplished both. The secondary transport arriving this morning confirms we've identified all primary targets." One investigator stepped toward Pierce, not walked, stepped, the way people stepped when they were about to change someone's entire future. "Dr. Pierce, the emergency board review you requested triggered a full federal audit of Seattle General's medical supply. Procurement. We found $2.3 million in fraudulent billing, all tied to your authorization codes." Another investigator produced handcuffs that caught the fluorescent light and threw it back like a promise. "Dr. Pierce, you're under arrest for Medicare fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and racketeering." The morning sun cut through the hospital's glass entrance like a blade as Danielle pushed through the double doors, her personal belongings in a cardboard box, termination papers already signed, a grace period for collecting the rest of her life measured in hours. The break room coffee still smelled like burnt grounds and regret. She wasn't supposed to be here anymore. By hospital policy, by Dr. Pierce's explicit orders, by every mechanism of institutional power designed to erase her, Danielle Ross was no longer an employee of Seattle General. She was a ghost with a box and nowhere to go except room 347 to say goodbye to the man she'd been sent here to protect. The emergency room doors burst open like someone had kicked them. A trauma team sprinted in pushing a stretcher, shouting numbers, pressure dropping, 84/52. Tachycardic at 138, and Danielle moved by instinct, her feet already turning toward the chaos. The cardboard box hit the floor. Nobody noticed. A surgeon was barking orders, "Get him to OR3, I want a full trauma workup, stat." The patient on the stretcher was conscious enough to move his head, his eyes scanning the room with the particular awareness of someone trained in threat assessment, and then his gaze locked on her face. The blood drained from his features. He reached out with one bloodied hand, his voice cracking in accented English, "Al-Malarika Al-Hamra. The Red Angel." The operating room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator hiss. Every person in that trauma bay, surgeons, nurses, orderlies, stopped moving. Danielle felt the weight of their stares like a physical force. The man on the stretcher was an insurgent commander, captured overseas, transported stateside under armed guard by two Marines whose hands immediately moved toward their sidearms as though the patient's recognition somehow constituted a threat. One of the Marines, a sergeant with the bearing of someone who'd stood watch on every continent, stepped forward, his jaw set. "How does he know you?" His hand moved to his duty belt, not reaching for a weapon, but signaling, "Something here doesn't add up." She said nothing. Composure was muscle memory now. Breathe. Don't move. Don't confirm or deny. Let the silence work. The Marine sergeant's eyes narrowed. He keyed his radio. "I need a personnel file on the nurse. Full clearance. Right now." 20 seconds of static. Then a voice on the other end, "Stand by." Danielle stood motionless, the cardboard box at her feet like evidence of a life that was about to change trajectory. The chaos of the trauma bay continued around them, nurses prepping the patient for surgery, pushing medication, but everyone's attention had fractured. The Marine sergeant was reading something on a secure tablet now, his expression shifting with each line. His lips moved silently, processing data. Then he looked up at her, and something fundamental changed in his face. Recognition. Not of her identity, he'd never met Captain Danielle Ross before, but of what her file contained. Silver Star. His voice was flat, stunned. You held a field hospital. Ramadi. 16 hours. Sustained enemy assault. Alone. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. He continued reading, and with each sentence his voice dropped lower, more reverent. Bronze Star. 2 Purple Hearts. Top secret clearance. 75th Ranger Regiment Liaison. He looked at the insurgent commander on the stretcher, then back at Danielle. You're the one they called the Red Angel. It wasn't a question. Behind him, through the trauma bay doors, a figure appeared in the hallway, a 2-star general in dress uniform, flanked by 4 people in dark suits carrying federal credentials. Pentagon investigators. The general's presence filled the room the way a predator fills a space, that particular calm that comes from having already survived the worst and earned the authority to command it. The general spoke without raising his voice. I need everyone out except medical personnel and Captain Ross. The room emptied in seconds. The general approached Danielle directly, his stars catching the fluorescent light. Captain, we've been looking for the source of the intelligence breach in the medical supply chain for 18 months. Your charts flagged 17 inconsistencies. Your questions about inventory cost us 3 months to follow. We should have connected it faster. He paused. You were investigating this alone. She nodded once. The general's expression hardened. Where is Dr. Pierce? She didn't know exactly, but she knew the hospital structure. Rounds began at 7 a.m., and Pierce always started on the 4th floor. The general turned to one of the suited investigators. Find him. Then he looked back at Danielle. You're coming with us. The audit you triggered uncovered a $4.2 million fraud scheme. Pierce has been billing for phantom procedures and kickbacks from MedSupply Solutions for 8 years. 17 co-conspirators. Federal RICO indictment is being drafted right now. 6 floors above them, in the urology wing where Dr. Pierce was conducting rounds with a resident, federal agent appeared without warning. No shouting, no drama, just 4 people with credentials and 1 set of handcuffs. Danielle didn't witness it, but the story moved through Seattle General like electricity. The surgeon who'd belittled her, who'd filed false incident reports, who'd orchestrated her humiliation and termination because she'd seen what he was doing, he walked out of the hospital in the middle of morning rounds with his hands behind his back, his face the color of clinical death. Staff members lined the hallways. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the click of handcuffs locking and the shuffle of his feet on the linoleum, each footstep a countdown to a cell. What happened in the next 8 hours was a legal demolition. Federal agents executed search warrants on Pierce's office, his home, his private accounts. The MedSupply Solutions CEO was arrested at a golf course in Scottsdale. 3 hospital administrators were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Pierce's medical license was suspended pending trial. The charges read like a catalogue of greed: 18 counts of Medicare fraud, conspiracy, racketeering, money laundering. His own demand for an investigation into Danielle's irregularities had been the thread that unraveled everything. His weapon had destroyed him. Danielle spent that day in a Pentagon office in downtown San Antonio, being debriefed by investigators and thanked by people whose names she wasn't permitted to write down. By evening, the hospital administrator was calling her personal phone, his voice trembling. Captain Ross, we had no idea, we owe you an apology. That words cannot. She cut him off, her tone clipped and military. Lieutenant Colonel Chen. What's his status? Stable. Recovering well. He's been asking for you. She walked to room 347 at 6:22 p.m., her legs moving through the physical exhaustion of adrenaline withdrawal. Chen was propped up in the hospital bed, his wife sitting vigil beside him, and the moment he saw her, he attempted to salute from his pillow, his shoulder wincing with the effort. Captain. Your son speaks very highly of you. His wife stood up, her expression shifting from curiosity to sudden understanding. You're Daniel's mother? He said you were the reason half his unit made it home from Ramadi. The words landed like a physical blow. Danielle blinked once, just once, and the moment passed. She maintained her composure, though her voice softened by exactly 2 degrees. "Your husband kept my son alive over there. I owed him the same." Chen gestured to the combat badge on his bedside table, the one she'd found in his boot during intake, the one that had confirmed his identity and locked her mission into place. "This belongs to your son now. He earned it in the same firefight where you earned your call sign." She took the badge, her fingers closing around it with the care of handling something sacred. The flag in her bag. The badge in her hand. 2 symbols, different wars, same cost. The hospital administrator appeared in the doorway an hour later. "Captain Ross, the board would like to offer you a position as Director of Emergency Medicine, if you're willing to stay on after your Army commitment ends." She looked at Chen, at his wife, at the badge still in her hand. "I need to finish my active duty assignment first. But after that, yes." 6 months later, Danielle walked through Seattle General's main entrance in Army dress uniform, her captain's bars polished to a mirror shine, her limp barely noticeable after 16 weeks of physical therapy at Walter Reed. The staff members she passed offered nods of respect now. The fear had been replaced by something heavier, gratitude mixed with awe. She made her way toward the loading dock, needing coffee before her first day as director, and stopped mid-stride. Dr. Pierce, in an orange Med Supply Solutions Incorporated safety vest, was unloading cardboard boxes from a delivery truck. His sentence had been reduced to 4 years through a plea deal with cooperating witnesses, but he'd been released pending appeal on the condition that he work for the company he'd conspired with. A living consequence. His eyes met hers for 1 second, just one, and something died in them. She didn't slow her pace. She didn't acknowledge him beyond that glance. He was a footnote now, a cautionary tale, a man who'd chosen wealth over ethics and lost everything. Inside her new office, Danielle unpacked a single box. The folded flag came out first, the one she'd carried from Ramadi, the one she'd held in the supply closet on her last shift as a nurse, and she placed it on her desk with military precision. Then the combat badge Chen had given her. She pinned it to the bulletin board beside the flag, securing it with the same care she'd used to stabilize wounded soldiers in field conditions. Beside the badge, she pinned a photograph of her son in Ranger uniform, smiling in a way that said, "I'm alive because of people like her." A Marine sergeant in civilian clothes knocked on her door at 2 p.m. "Captain Ross, I'm rotating to a new post. Wanted to thank you for the intel that helped us close the med supply case. 17 people arrested across 4 states." She shook his hand. "That's what we do, Sergeant." He grinned. "Heard the Ramadi prisoner recognized you. Guess the Red Angel legend travels." She allowed herself the smallest smile. Legends are just people who didn't quit. Through her office window, she could see the loading dock. Pierce was unloading another box, his movements slow and defeated, his back bent under the weight of consequences. Danielle turned away from the window and checked her watch. The next shift briefing began in 4 minutes. She pulled her hair into a tight bun, clipped her credentials to her white coat, and strode toward the emergency room. Footsteps echoing like a command. The ER doors parted before her like salute. "So here's what I want you to take from this: the quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. That person you overlooked? The one you thought wasn't important? They might be carrying more weight than you could ever understand." Danielle Ross spent 3 months invisible by choice, protecting someone she loved, while a man with power and prestige used every tool at his disposal to destroy her. And she didn't break. She didn't falter. She stayed composed, stayed professional, and let the truth do what truth does: it rises. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because we post these stories every single week. Like this video if you believe that real heroism looks different than we expect. And comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? Because I want to hear your story. Thanks for watching.